Hey guys, I'm going to attempt to do something through the video channel here that I've set up. Have a bunch of you guys that have asked me to get a better feel for how to apply the paint to a wet area and come up with something more solid in terms of the pigment application and how it stays there. So what I'm going to do here is let's do it step by step. I'll take a little bit of clear water and I'm going to wet the paper. That's the first thing that we're going to do. We want to wet the paper thoroughly, and in terms of wetting the paper thoroughly, we want to make sure that that water is saturated pretty much into the pigment of the paper, into the fibers of the paper, sorry. So we're going to let it sit for a while, and while it sits for a while and it soaks in thoroughly, notice that I keep applying water over and over this. Now don't worry about some of the, you'll notice some of the dead spots around the edge. I'm using a paper that is a little bit old, but it'll get the purpose, we'll be able to get done what we need to get done here. So, first of all, once the paper soaks in, once the water soaks into the paper, thoroughly into the fibers of the paper, what will happen is that the glare or the gleam of this paper will subside a bit. It'll get a little duller, but it'll still be thoroughly soaked. And that's basically when you want to work with the different consistencies of paint on a damp brush. So what we're going to do is, first of all, what I want to do is I'm going to take some area over in this area here. I'm going to take some of this and I'm going to apply a wet into wet wash. Okay, so let's just take it. I got some crap on my palette here. We'll just make this a brown, dull, neutral colored wash. And we'll just do it over here, all right? So here's basically wet into wet. That's wet, almost color water, right? That's all it is I got a very wet palette, and I'm just picking up the stuff that's on my palette. But basically, all this really is it's just colored water, all right? And if I put it into a wet area, and I'm going to soften this up as I go, you're going to see, and what'll happen is that there'll be a natural gradation. But this is so wet that it's going to lighten up totally, and what'll end up happening is it'll dissipate. I'm going to let it sit here for a while and dry. So, and I'm going to stop the tape, and then we'll come back to it. Okay? Okay, we're still recording, and now you can start to see some of the glisten on the paper sort of dissipate a bit, and it's going to get a little bit duller. And the wash that I put on, although this edging right here, the water got underneath the back side of this, so it's hitting the edges. But nonetheless, this wash is softly going to continue to lighten. The bottom line is that we're dealing with a dynamic situation. So watercolor by the nature of its media is going to lighten as it dries. But I wanted you to see some of that. But this is light enough so that it's still pretty wet. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a damp brush. Let me take some tissue, and I'm going to dip my brush into water, and I'm going to take the water out of the brush. Right? Taking the water out of the brush. Here's what I'm doing here. I'm taking the water out of the brush. So now I have a damp brush, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to pick up some pigment. Let's just pick up some yellow ochre and mix it up so that the yellow ochre is about 50% consistency. Now let's see. Let's rephrase that. It's probably about, pigment-wise, it's about 25% to water, 75% water. Now I'm going to just make a stroke here, okay? That stroke right there with about about 25 to 35, 40% consistency of pigment to water, and the only way we can do this is to just continue to work with it. You're seeing what you can see what's happening. I put on, there's a little bit more pigment here than there is over here. That pigment is slothfully going to dissipate, but it's going to stay pretty much where it is right now because there's more consistency of pigment on the brush than there is water. Now let's just go in and let's take another color. Let's take some burnt sienna. I'm going to mix this up a little bit heavier. This is a lot of pigment on my brush and very little water. It's probably about maybe 75% pigment, 25% water. And you can't see it, but I'm mixing this up. I probably should actually do that, put that under the camera as well, but let's do it a step at a time. And I'm going to do the same thing, look. Okay? Stays pretty much where it's at. This is really heavy consistency now. Notice what's happening? It stays pretty much where it is. It's going to softly dissipate. There's going to be a problem. But notice even some of this stuff here is starting to dry out a little bit. I skipped it a bit. But the point I'm getting at is if you want pigment to hold, and you don't want it to go all over the place, and I'm going to do it once again. This is more pigment. It's about 75% pigment, 25% water. We're going to do it right here. Look, that's not going to go anywhere. Now that's still wet. The paper is still wet. So you can move from very watery pigment over here, which is basically 25%, or it's almost colored water, and you can see it's softly dissipating. It's softly drying out. To about 25% pigment, to about 50% pigment, to about 75% pigment. And the more you put into this, the more you'll be able to hold, the more pigment you put in, the more pigment you can put in, you'll be able to hold the value and color from just going everywhere. It's a matter of practice. You're just going to have to continue to do this. Now let me also prove to you that this is still wet. This is all still wet. If I do something that's very loose, here we're going to go back to colored water. This is wet into wet. If I just do this, watch what happens. It's still going to, see it? It's still going to soften up. This is just color water. It's pretty much 25% water, maybe even more, with some tonal value in it, and all I'm doing is again applying water into water. Here, this little spot right here, water into water, watch. All right, that's water into water. This is pigment, more pigment into water. This is lighter, it's more water on the brush. So you've got to learn to control how much pigment is on this brush to how much water. Now, in something like that I just did right here, I can actually take, here's my brush, I'm drying it out, so it's just a damp brush, and I can actually take and run, watch, and I can lift that out, and I just took a damp brush and ran it through there and lifted it out. Again, the same thing with this. It doesn't make any difference what I'm doing. I'm going to do the same thing right here. I can lift it out. So we can put water into water, and you're going to get this tonal value, and it'll dry over time, it'll soften over time. There'll be a natural gradation process. But if you want to really create an area where there's more pigment, that is, the pigment is going to stay where you put it, then you need to apply more pigment into this wet paper. The paper's still wet. Yes, it's not dry. This paper is not dry at all. It's wet. But because I'm applying more pigment on the brush and less water, I'm getting the ability to control or hold this. Now notice how this, as this dries, I'm lifting here. So basically, this is how I would normally do branches. I would actually take and do a tree trunk, sort of something like that, if I wanted to lift it out. But the point I'm getting at is, it's very important to allow this pigment to be on a wet piece of paper and stay where it's at by the amount of pigment that you put on the brush. That's critical. Okay, so that's basically the 11. The lesson for this quick video. Wet colored water on wet paper. No control whatsoever. You don't have any control over that. It's going to go wherever it wants to go. 25 to 35% pigment on wet paper, and you have limited control. You have some control, but you notice all of this dissipated over here, and it's going to continue to work. It's going to continue to dissipate. It's going to continue to soften as the paper dries, and it's going to get softer, and it's fine. Now, this is good. This is good for not having hard edges. I mean, you can do a lot of good stuff. I can actually go back in here, for instance, and take some heavier pigment, all right, and apply some heavier pigment here and there. As you can see what I'm doing, and it's going to pretty much stay right there. But that paper is still wet. It wouldn't soften. It wouldn't do this. You'd have a hard, if that paper were dry, that would be a hard edge that I just put on there. But that'll eventually soften up. You can do a lot with this. And I'm using this 1-inch brush just to show you what I'm talking about. Right? So again, if I use you've seen me dry out this brush, dampening it out. And I'm gonna take a brush and I'm gonna make it wet, and I'm gonna do the same thing. I got a wet brush. I don't know if you can see the wetness in that brush, but I got a wet brush, and I'm going into this damp area. And you can do the same thing. You can pick up. Notice it's wet, and because I put water in there, the water is going to soften out the edges a bit more. So these are the things that you need to understand when you're applying paint that is pigment to a watered area. Look, let's just do this. This is water. I'm drying this out. Coming across that way, drying it out. So that's the lesson for the day, or the quick lesson that I'm just doing right now. Here's just pigment. Look, just pigment. And this is nice and dark. See, this is the drier area. Notice it's in the wet area. I did quick snaps, and you can see what happens. It's skipping up here where it's drier, but the paper's not totally dry. This is still wet. Into a wetted area where it's going to work, slowly dissipate. And what I'll do is, and you notice that when I did the watery area over here, and brought this in here, this is all going to soften down. So this is a wonderful way of doing different things. Now, some of you like to scrape in, so we can actually do some of that scraping at certain points. For instance, I can scrape. If I scrape in here right now, this is so wet that the scraping is going to fill in. You can see what's happening right here. The water's filling in the hole. So it's a way to get, if you want to get some branches, for instance, and you want them darker, you can scrape in a real wet area and you can create these crevices that these lines will go into. However, if you take an area like this and you scrape it, that's dry enough so that it's going to create a nice thin line, but it's still wet, but it's dry enough so that you can create these thin lines. If it gets too dry, that's still wet, but it's dry enough so that it's creating a nice negative shape. It's white line. All right, and again, scraping. Okay, but if I'm down here, this is wet. What's going to happen is that that's so wet that it's going to create a darker line. So you can create white lines or lighter lines, negative, so that the dark goes around the light. this is a matter of learning what you can do with this. It's all timing. I noticed what I did is this was all too wet in here. This is okay. This is good. This is good. But this was still a little bit too wet in here, so the line filled in this area right here. But those are the things that you have to work with and you have to practice doing in order to become proficient at wet into wet watercolor. Once totally dry, let me see if I can get, I'm going to get, now I'm going to start to put in some, you can take a thinner brush for instance. This is drier. It's still damp, but it's drier. You can see it skipped. This is wet. This is wet into wet. A little darker value on top of here, on top of the light area. Using this kind of brush right here. That's all we're doing is just adding. Now, you have another, adding a little bit of tonal value. It's a little darker. This is about 50% water, 50% pigment, and I'm adding it on top of this. Okay, just so you can see what happens. And the more pressure you put down here, the wider it's going to be, or you can do a real thin line as well. Watch. Okay, so sometimes if you guys are out there, you want to do something like, well, I don't know, it's a cat o' nine tails, I suppose, or anything like that. You can notice you can do something like that by just look. See the difference between here where it's wet into wet, and here where it's wet into dry area. This is going to skip. See that? So doing a texture like that is interesting because this is still damp, but not totally dry, but still now you can create some texture. But if I flatten the brush, I can fill it in. So moving it quickly, moving the brush quickly, you can see what happens. You get skipping. Moving it slowly, you're going to get a solid line. No skipping. So that's just some of the things that you have to be aware of when you're working with wet into wet. Colored water, pretty much anywhere from, I would say, 90% water to a little bit of pigment to about 75% water with a little bit of pigment. But notice how soft this is, how it went, how it just dissipated. Okay, again, this one right here is about 75% water, 25% pigment. This is about 50-50, 50 water, 50 pigment. This is, again, about 75% pigment and about 25% water. And this is a little bit more, a little deeper. Probably about 80%, 85% pigment and a little bit of water. This is 100% pigment. Here, no water, very little. But when I say no water, this is all with a damp brush. So that's it for now. Thanks for taking a look at this thing. Hopefully it'll help you, and we'll talk to you again soon.